Hey everybody, this is a piece by Bruno Bongiovanni titled Maximilien Rubel. It's originally written in Italian. First section, the quote Unfinished Marx. The appearance of Marx's collected works, has been hailed as a quote sign of the times. For some 50 years after his death, Marx had been published by a variety of intellectuals associated with labor parties. University culture had generally neglected the Marxian intellectual legacy, which is viewed as the work of a revolutionary agitator and not as that of a social scientist. Despite the persistently inaccurate and poorly documented critiques that Marx's writings continued to receive from academic circles, the situation changed in the West only after 1945. The quote economic Marx of the works, the second volume of which appeared only in 1968, immediately emerged as the most diligent result of a scrupulous Marxological research. The first volume of the works had only a limited impact because it was conventionally prefaced by Francois Peroux and because it contained Marx's so-called economic opus, already published in his own lifetime. The first volume also contains a 3-page quote notice by Rubel, the editor, and a vast quote chronology, along with an impressive display of notes and indices that, given the state of today's Marxforschung, show high scholarship and compare well with the greatest Marxologist ever, David Borisovich Ryazanov, murdered by Stalin, who had disappeared under Stalin in the early 1930s after making major contributions to the reconstruction of the Marx-Engels opus. In the quote notice, Rubel outlines his project to free Marx's work from the ideological incrustations, sedimenting it since the last decades of the 19th century. Rubel emphasizes something everyone knows but which is always forgotten, that is, the incompleteness of Marx's work. Footnote. In the preface to the 1859 Critique of Political Economy, Marx admits to having omitted an introduction, not for any lack of words, but as Rubel notes, because it anticipates results yet to come. Of this project, Marx managed only to complete a small part, and aside from the 1859 Critique, only the first part of the planned 6 sections appeared during his lifetime. Thus, according to Rubel, we only have a fragment that, through the work of Marx's successors, became a system. End footnote. The second volume, containing Marx's posthumous quote economic writings, is bound to generate considerable discussion. First of all, the volume opens with a 132-page quote introduction by Rubel. Footnote. The volume also contains the 1844 manuscripts whose original, like many others, can be found in Amsterdam, but whose first publication in the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe goes back to 1932, whereas there's also the manuscript on wages of 1847, first published by Ryazanov in the book Unter dem Banner des Marxismus. Or maybe it's a journal. Excerpts from the Grundrisse, 1857 to 58, never mentioned by Engels and first described by Ryazanov in a November 20th, 1923 letter to the Moscow Socialist Academy, and finally, the Materials for the Economy, 1861 to 65, and Materials for the second volume of Capital, 1869 to 1879, and for the third volume of Capital, 1864 to 1875. End footnote. Taking a fresh look at Ryazanov's work, Rubel questions the quote official version of Marx's posthumous writings as presented by Engels' publication of the second and third volumes of Capital, 1885 and 1894, and Kautsky's edition of the fourth volume, 1905 to 1910, also known as Theories of Surplus Value, republished in a revised edition in 1956 by the Berlin and Moscow Institutes of Marxism-Leninism. Engels' edition of the second volume of Capital contains only 13 instead of 21 chapters, and the third volume 28, chapters instead of 52. Manuscript passages retracing the 1859 critique and the first volume of Capital were eliminated, while some variants of Engels' choice were replaced by others found more significant. Rubel does not claim to have provided a definitive edition of Marx's economics, partly because there were too many things missing at the time of the collected works publication as a result of the Moscow Marx-Lenin Institute's secrecy rules in cultural policy, in particular the 23 notebooks of 1861 to 63, which are what the theories of surplus value are composed of. According to Rubel, Engels did both too much and too little. Too much since, although careful, he presented Marx's work as complete, thus contributing to the creation and legitimation of, quote, Marxism. He also did too little by neglecting a great many manuscripts that were published only after the, quote, Marxist system had already been constructed. Thus, as new manuscripts were published, commentators earnestly sought to insert them into the already existing system. Fresh parts were used in support of internal diatribes between, quote, determinists and, quote, voluntarists, quote, subjective humanists, and, quote, objective materialists, quote, etc. Thus, the publication of previously unpublished texts did not encourage a return to Marx, but rather their integration into, quote, Marxism. In contrast, the publication of Marx's 2 works volumes dedicated to economics constitutes a real return to Marx. In his introduction, Rubel once again runs through the history of the critique of political economy. After an initial liberal phase, Marx's intellectual career developed from the vantage point of a critique of politics and of the state, as can be seen from the 1843 Kreuznach Meditation, a critique that, together with the Jewish question, was to become an anarchist and proletarian manifesto. Sorry, I'm looking at the footnotes here. Anyway, not seeing anything particularly important. Marx's first economic lectures originate from a trauma that was to last a lifetime. From it sprang the foundation of De la misère des classes laborieuses in Angleterre et en France, 1840, by the Christian Eugène Beret. Proudhon's book, What is Property, of 1840, and the book Outline of a Critique of Political Economy, 1844, young Engels' ingenious work. It was during this period that Marx developed a theoretical obsession whose first results came with the 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts. Yet according to Rubel, Marx never abandoned the project of writing a critique of politics and of the state, but following the exposition of the materialist conception of history, the German ideology, 1845 to 46, Marx began to see in production the departure point for all further analyses. From then on, Marx had to come to terms with Proudhon, who had initiated him into the critique of political economy, but who insisted on analyzing capital from the viewpoint of capital and poverty from the viewpoint of poverty. Rubel challenges the claim that Marx changed his mind, and that Marx's Capital contains what was envisaged in the original project. According to Rubel, Marx never gave up on the colossal work he had outlined. Sorry, I'm looking at the footnote here if there's anything to read. Add to this his journalistic activities, illnesses, and a devouring passion for study, etc., and one begins to understand why Marx could only finish a small part of the immense work he had planned. Footnote: Marx accumulated statistics, grappled with the Russian question, and started to learn Russian, followed great international events with keen interest, and was fascinated with natural history and the first advances of Darwinism. Marx delved competently into anthropology and ethnology, and also made himself part of the history of the international workers' movement. End footnote. Regarding the critique of political economy and of the state, we will just have to content ourselves with the early works written prior to the elaboration of the materialist conception of history. Marx never spoke of, quote, historical materialism, end quote, much less of, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, the backbone of Diamat. In any case, Rubel is convinced that in the fourth part of his projected and never finished critique of the state, Marx would have resumed and developed the 1843 to 44 themes by reworking the profoundly libertarian and communist themes of political alienation. In 1965, in France, Althusser published Pour Marx and Reading for Marx and Reading Capital. Althusser's contribution to Reading Capital is on this channel. Also, check out the book Detour of Theory about Althusser that I have on this channel. Anyway, in 1965 in France, Althusser published Pour Marx and La Capitale, which developed the much too celebrated concept of epistemological coupure. I guess it's epistemological break. The objective was to deprive Marxism of Marx's early work and to make Marx's Capital into a finished and homogeneous book, the Bible of a system expounded once and for all. Quote, Marxism. In a short note, Rubel observes ironically that Althusser is only half right. Not just the early Marx, but Marx as a whole is foreign to, quote, Marxism. Yet while Althusser's works have enjoyed a wide circulation, Rubel's work has remained practically unknown. New section, Marxian Ethics and the Road to Collapse. Rubel was born October 10, 1905 in Czernowitz, Bukovina, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and which became part of Romania in 1918. Cernalti, and which is today part of Russia. Cernavci? I don't know. Which is today part of Russia, Cernavci. After finishing school in Vienna and Cernalti, where Rubel received degrees in law and philosophy, Rubel went to Paris, where between 1931 and 1934 he devoted himself to German studies, and in 1934 received a degree in literature from the Sorbonne. In 1937, he became a French citizen. He was mobilized in the 1939-40 Drôle de Guerre and served in transports and sanitary services. In 1945-47, Rubel was a private teacher of German law and philosophy, and his first Marxist publication came in 1947-48. In 1947, Rubel became attaché de recherche at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. In 1954, Rubel was professor of literature and charge de recherche at CNRS, and in 1959, Rubel was made maître de recherche. In 1957, he also became director of Études de Marxologie, and in following years, he taught at various French, American, and German universities. As already mentioned, Rubel's activity as a, quote, Marxologist began in 1947. In the Revue Socialiste, he presented Un inédit de Karl Marx, Le Travail aliéné, which is simply a chapter from the 1844 manuscripts, of which in France there existed at that time only a partial translation in volume 6 of the philosophical works of Karl Marx. Rubel wrote that the work of the early Marx was imbued with a deep ethical spirit that remains valid at a time when free workers are transformed into state slaves and of individual capitalists into bureaucrats or technocrats. The previous issue of the 1947 Revue Socialiste had published an article by Leon Blum entitled Révolution Socialiste ou Révolution Directoriale, a socialist response to Burnham's theses in the book The Managerial Revolution, a book that was an unfortunate plagiarism of an obscure Italian text by Bruno Rizzi. That's very much disputable. I don't think that. I think that uh, um, Bruno. I can't see a way that Burnham could have had access to Bruno Ricci's work. I think a lot of these ideas, so to speak, were in the air. In it, Burnham denied that the decline of capitalism would lead to socialism. Burnham argued that in its place would arise a totalitarian bureaucratic regime whose leading class would be, as already in Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, and America under the New Deal, managers and directors of public and private enterprises. Instead of the proletariat, these are the people destined to become the real gravediggers of capitalism and of the bourgeoisie. Bloom was frightened by Burnham's terrifying hypothesis, but provided a social democratic response in the same way that Leon Trotsky, at the dawn of World War II, had reacted to Ricci's theses. Bloom wrote that even though, quote, managerial societies are likely to emerge during a transition period, they would eventually move towards socialism, quote, by some sort of democratic attraction, quote. According to Leon Bloom, it is even possible that in the Soviet Union itself, which Burnham saw as the model for future regimes, this transition had probably already started. Apparently, Burnham's theses aroused great interest within French socialist circles. In another essay of the same 1947 Revue Socialiste, Rubel reported and commented on the theoretical limits of the correspondence between Karl Marx and Vera Sasulich, published by Ryazanov in the 1928 Marx Engels archives. And in the same year, Rubel also published part of his introduction to Marx's anthology, Page Récit pour une éthique socialiste, which appeared in 1948 and was reprinted with few changes in 1970. The first paragraph of the essay is entitled Socialisme ou Barbarie. If one recalls that Claude Lafort's essay, La Contradiction de Trotsky, appeared intermittently in Le Thème Moderne between 1948, one realizes to what degree Rubel's early works had circulated among those refuting Bolshevik and even Trotskyist ideology and, quote, Marxism as state ideology and party dogma. The fundamental problem in this, quote, introduction is seen as the relation between science and action, between Bernstein's, quote, revisionism and Sorel and Labriola's, quote, voluntarism. According to Rubel, Luxemburg reconciled economic determinism and spontaneity by reintroducing the Marxian theory of the collapse as the road to barbarism. Capitalism's inherent tendency for capitalism, including the collapse of all values, could lead either to socialism or to barbarism if proletarians of all countries did not rise in an ethico-revolutionary spontaneous effort. Yeah, that was kind of to my understanding. Is that there's different politics that revolve around different theories of collapse, and I think to my understanding, at least via Michael Heinrich, is that Rosa Luxemburg's theory was about like, yes, there will be a collapse, and we need to like prevent it because it will be so ruinous of civilization that we need to intervene prior to this ultimate collapse, as opposed to social democrats who are like the collapse will come, or traditional like Kautsky, I think, had more of an idea of like the crisis will like make us popular and we'll achieve victory in parliament once this collapse happens, so we don't have to be too revolutionary because objectively things will, or situation will become revolutionary. Anyway, for Rubel, this was crucial, for in the second instance, it would become possible for totalitarian barbarism of a managerial variety to come about. If instead a Marxian ethics of revolutionary action were to develop along with the capitalist collapse, Luxemburg's positive alternative would win out. This would entail workers' self-emancipation and the rise of socialism. Dealing with the party, Rubel reproduces some fascinating pages from the Marx Freiligrath correspondence, where Marx distinguishes between the formal party, one that is from time to time embodied in visible institutions and which arises directly from social conflicts, and the historical party, quote, the invisible party of real knowledge, end quote, i.e. the alliance of science and the proletariat. After some other articles in the Revue Socialiste in 1951, Rubel participated directly in the drawn-out debate concerning the Burnham thesis. He discussed the sociological and economic literature contained in Burnham's work, Veblen, Rathenau, Burrell, and Means, and contrasted with the Marxian positions of Bernstein, Renner, Kuhnhoff, Helferding, and Horkheimer. Rubel saw a similarity between Burnham's theses and Renner's self-socialization of capital, as well as Kautsky's theory on the protean character of the state, and concluded that an anti-Marxist like Burnham, who entertained the possibility of a catastrophic way out, could well be more faithful to Marx than many other Marxists. Apparently, Rubel did not know that Burnham had plagiarized his thesis from a Marxist. Again, one should be very skeptical about calling Rizzi a Marxist. If he had Marxian influences, which I think is true, most definitely, and that he skirted the what is in Marcel van der Linden's words, skirted the outskirts of left communism and Trotskyism, he was very much thoroughly a crank. He believed, Rizzi had the view that bureaucratic collectivism, which is what he thought was created in the Soviet Union, which was kind of like the horizon for world civilization, was a progressive step and would lead to socialism. So therefore, the working class of the world, whereas unlike Trotskyists and left communists, the working class of the world therefore should support not just the Soviet Union, but also Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, which were leading the way to bureaucratic collectivism faster, and thus to socialism faster. So he viewed as, the cunning of history would, whatever his actual opinions are about them, he viewed, as sometimes almost like accelerationist in some way, that this bringing the coming to the full fruition of bureaucratic collectivism would lead the way to socialism. That was his position. He was also deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. Not in a very straight up way, which is kind of buried in a lot of the discourse about Rizzi. Even though I have pieces by Bruno Rizzi on this channel, I have the first part of bureaucratization of the world on here, and I also have the parts that were cut out from that in the published English edition that are extremely anti-Semitic. So one should be cautious about calling Rizzi that. I think Rizzi is kind of in a league of his own. To say his Marxism is extremely limited. And also Burnham was a Marxist when he was doing a lot of the preconditions, a lot of the pre-thinking for the managerial revolution. He was in the Socialist Workers' Party, the main Trotskyist party, then in the Workers' Party for about a week, and then broke with Marxism completely. According to Rubel, contemporary events throw new light on the Marxian doctrine of the social collapse along lines that both the quote orthodoxy and the quote revisionists were unable to predict. In October the same year, Rubel was forced to polemicize with the socialist Robert Mosse. He wrote that Marxian theory should be rejected wholesale on the basis of its effects in Russia. Rubel maintained that 1. There is no Marxist theory of value There is no Marxist theory of value. In Marx, there is only a critique of the classical theories of value. 2. The antagonistic dualism of classes is not an eternal and omnipresent reality, but expresses only the simple historical tendency of capitalist societies. 3. For Marx, the materialist conception of history was neither a philosophy nor a science, but only a way of approaching the study of society. Footnote. In the early 1950s, still in Revue Socialiste and in Preuve, Rubel dedicated some polemical essays on the modality of Marx and Engels' publications in Stalinist Russia. Specifically, he dealt with the censorship imposed by chauvinist Stalinism upon Marx's piece Revelations on the Secret Diplomatic History of the 18th Century, and Engels' The Foreign Policy of the Czars, which are very anti-Tsarism, anti-Russia. And this is kind of the thing you see some works now are kind of like talking about different works emphasizing Marx's hostility to Tsarism, hostility to Russian imperialism, are kind of based upon some of these documents, I'm pretty sure, where they definitely at least draw from them partially. Anyway, end footnote. New section. Bibliography between Utopia and Science. One second. Sorry, it's annoying. Come on, you bastard. Sorry about that. There is nothing novel about describing the ideological cultural climate of the 1950s as a split between McCarthyist hysteria and dejected Stalinist oppression. There are few documents testifying to independence of mind in view of this climate. There are few documents testifying to independence of mind in view of this climate, especially with regard to Marxological studies and the development of socialist theory. This seems especially the case in France. In 1954, the first volume of Marxist Studien appeared in Germany. In France, there were Socialisme ou Barbarie, 1949 to 65, sustained by Castoriadis and Lafort, and Argument, a journal in which Rubel also wrote. If you're interested in knowing more about Argument, check out the books I have on here by Christos Nemos and Mark Poster. Footnote. The themes of these theoretical efforts were the critique of bureaucracy and totalitarianism, free research in light of the classics, free from the liturgical apparatus of Stalinist obscurantism, on the issues of reform and revolution, party and class, the councils, development of modern capitalism, the socio-historical physiognomy of classes, technology, and the intellectuals. I want to look this German thing up because I've never heard of this Marxismus Studien thing. Or maybe I have and just as... Yeah, it's not anything that's immediately jumping out on German Wikipedia, so I don't know what that means necessarily, but where the hell am I? Given the idolatry of Marxism-Leninism understood as a system embodying power and represented as absolute truth, and given the uncompromising rejection of any socialist hypothesis in the name of an uncritical defense of the quote, free world, there was a need for a return to a critical Marxian discourse. But what was the status of such discourse? It may seem paradoxical, yet despite an impressive amount of publications, and at a time when, quote, Marxism, obligatory state doctrine for an enormous number of people, has been established as the dominant 20th century ideology, little is really known about it. Before 1956, there was no one to publish the complete works of Marx and Engels. Between 1956 and 1968, between 1956 and 1968, the 41 volumes of Marx Engels Werk, MEW, were published in East Berlin. Footnote: as is well known, Dietz Publishers has started on a new 100-volume series of Mega beginning in the mid-1970s. Of great importance among the 10 volumes published by 1979 are Volumes 3, Tome 1, Section 2, containing the first original edition of the first 5 notebooks of a manuscript edited by Marx in August 1861 to July 1863, again, which is the basis for theories of surplus value. I don't know if this is called Mega 2 yet, but this is a revived thing. I think this is obviously after the break of the original Mega project, Stalinism and World War II. Mega 2 was reinitiated in this period. And I think kind of narrowly escaped oblivion after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. Anyway, end footnote. This edition is incomplete and full of gaps. Before 1956, however, even that was not available. These Werk, which today are an exclusive source of reference, can be seen as the result of liberalization during the Khrushchev years. Of course, it is impossible here to outline the history of Marx-Engels editions. Engels had already thought about a Gesamtausgabe, complete collection, after his death, but after his death the prospect grew dim because of a large number of successors, often in conflict with each other: Eleanor Marx, Kautsky, Bernstein, Babel, Merling, etc. Only after 1917 did this prospect become more concrete, when many fragments of this large mosaic were published, somewhat disjointedly, by SPD circles. Russia even had the right person, Ryazanov, already devoted to the study of Marx-Engels texts entrusted to German Social Democrats. Lenin helped Ryazanov safely bring to the Moscow Marx-Lenin archives photocopies and originals of texts constituting the colossal Marx-Engels intellectual legacy, quote, sorry, there's no quote, that's just dirt, hitherto dispersed in German Social Democratic archives and public and private libraries in Europe and in the United States. Ryazanov completed this enormous work in very little time with the active and valuable collaboration of many SPD supporters at a time when relations between the SPD, unified with part of the USPD after the Holocaust, and the Soviet Communist Party were not exactly cordial. The Moscow Institute and the German Gesellschaft für Sozialforschung founded 2 publishing firms in Berlin and Frankfurt. But in 1930, the year the Stalinist campaign reached its apex against, quote, social fascists, this already weak collaboration had to be cut short. The following year, accused of collaborating with Social Democrats and Mensheviks, Ryazanov was fired from his job of institute director, expelled from the party, and forced to disappear. In the meantime, however, Ryazanov had started on the vast enterprise known as Mega, projected in 40 volumes to be divided into 3 sections. 1. Philosophical, economic, historical, and political works except Capital. 2. Capital in a variety of versions and with all unpublished manuscripts. 3. The complete correspondence. In 1930, Ryazanov published only 5 volumes and some other text in 2 issues of the Marx-Engels archive, the most conspicuous in size being Engels' Dialectics of Nature. Another 7 volumes were published by his successor, Adoratsky, until in 1935, the Mega was abruptly interrupted with the complete Marx-Engels works going only up to 1848 to 49. Footnote: the 1927 to 1935 volumes of the Old Mega have been reissued by Verlag Detlef Auferman, 1970. And footnote: only a Russian edition was resumed, discontinuous, incomplete, and lacking the rigor of the enterprise's original founder. In the early 1950s, the situation was unchanged and actually worsened. The 1933 publication of Resultate des unmittelbaren Produktionsprozesses, the unpublished Chapter 6, or which is titled, translates as The Results of the Immediate Production Process, by Archive Marxe e Engelse, and of the Grundrisse in 1939 to 41, produced only a feeble echo, and for many, quote, Marxism was a finished system entrusted to the hands of the party, or at best contained in the Communist Manifesto and Capital. Naturally, many were unhappy with this situation, but the interruption of the Great Mega and the confusion of headings following the, quote, scientific and political rupture between social democracy and Stalinist Bolshevism offered no help toward a critical understanding of events. Above all, there was no dated, scrupulous inventory of Marx's intellectual legacy. The only thing available at the time was Ernst Drohn's old bibliography, abridged and abbreviated and put together according to questionable criteria. Having completed the first phase of his work, Rubel in 1956 turned to the presses the first scientifically prepared bibliography of Marx's work, with an appendix listing also Engels' works. From then on, the Marxforschung began to go free of party diatribes and ideological prejudices. Only by exhibiting the complexity and richness of Marx's polymorphous legacy is it possible to leave behind the perennial temptation to use that legacy as an instrumentum regni. Parallel to the bibliography was the outline of a Marx intellectual biography published in 1957. It takes up again the themes from the 1948 anthology and elaborates the dualism between revolutionary ethics and critical sociology, for which he was criticized by reviewers. Here there are some similarities with Korsch, with whom Rubel was corresponding during the 1950s. Rubel was, of course, a council communist. In any case, Marx's early works take up considerable space in the bibliography, testifying to the anti-Hegelian and anti-statist protest in the name of concrete society. For Rubel, this protest is in harmony with Kierkegaard's anti-Hegelianism, invoked in the name of the concrete individual. Rubel emphasized the influence of Spinoza's ethics on Marx. His passage from liberalism to communism, the critique of bureaucracy understood as an elite of esoteric knowledge, the transition from the analysis of religion to politics through Feuerbach's mediation, and the critique of political emancipation in the name of human emancipation. According to Rubel, for Marx, critique becomes the par excellence theoretical instrument for articulating, on the level of consciousness and knowledge, the ethical and revolutionary project of abandoning the old world. The materialist conception of history following the critique of politics provided Marx with a research method that Rubel defines as critical or pragmatic sociology. A rather unfortunate expression probably meant to underline Marx's debt vis-a-vis Saint-Simon. Initially, Marx had sided with the Saint-Simonian proletarian ethics in support of the, quote, poorest and largest class, unquote. Later, however, he disclaimed the elitist character of Saint-Simonianism in order to locate the proletariat's own external consciousness in a class outside the proletariat. Marx owes his idea of the proletariat's self-liberation to Flora Tristan. From this follows the rejection of all party or state centralism, expropriating the dynamic autonomy of a class that can and must be both the subject and object of emancipation. At this time, Marx introduced the theme of Gemeinwesen, of man's communal being, das kommunistische Wesen, concerning which Rubel says that, in some passages, instead of Gemeinwesen, Marx had first written die Kommune, a term he later erased. This is the starting point of reflection on communism, which is not only the conclusive approach to economic quantitative development, but is the real being of man exiled in a civil society separate from and oppressed by the state, atomized and parceled out, framed in and bureaucratized. Like critical sociology and political economy, the materialist conception of history is a method for analyzing social obstacles that stifle Gemeinwesen and impede its free affirmation. Gemeinwesen is the essence of communism, what makes possible its realization. In turn, communism is the real movement that gives free rise to Gemeinwesen. It is that social action which leaves the much too long prehistory of humanity clearly behind. New section: Bonapartism and Stalinism. In 1917, Ryazanov had published in Stuttgart Marx's main journalistic writings from the 1852 to 1856 period. According to the initial plan, publication would continue to include writings from 1856 to 1862. The Russian Revolution and Ryazanov's return to his country and to the Bolshevik ranks interrupted the project. Next, Ryazanov started planning the Mega, which would naturally include Marxian writings left previously unpublished. As already seen, Ryazanov's activities in the Mega were often abruptly interrupted. Thus, during the 1850s, Marx's lesser-known writings were precisely those of the decade on which Ryazanov had worked before February 1917, among which the New York Daily Tribune articles stand out for both quality and variety. Faced with this situation, Rubel in 1960 published an essay on Marx's position on Bonapartism. I have pieces about Bonapartism, Marx and Bonapartism by another important Marx scholar of the 20th century, Hal Draper. Faced in this situation, Rubel in 1960 published an essay on Marx's position on Bonapartism in order to deal with the themes of the period in question, starting mainly with 1856, the year when Ryazanov's publishing stops, and because the analysis of the Bonapartist power system, though dispersed in the inevitably diffused fine dust of journalistic accounts, is central to understanding the continuity of the critique of politics in Marx's thought. Footnote: In this study, which runs through Marx's writings beyond Ryazanov's pre-1917 edition to the collapse of the Second Empire and the Commune, Rubel deals with the Marxian interpretation of the evolution of French history, the comparison of Napoleon I and Napoleon III, and appraisals of the Crimean War and the European system of alliances with all the related problems of diplomatic history, on the Praetorian regime and the imperial military socialism of Bonaparte Minor, or on Franco-Russian relations and the affinity between Bonapartism and Tsarism, the latter being the model of all integral despotism, on the Mexican adventures, and on the fatal Franco-Prussian War. End footnote. The special interest caused by Bonapartism, however, stems from the fact that Marx identified it as the moment of supreme antagonism between the state and civil society. Bonapartism is not so much the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, or the way a ruling class expresses itself. It is a particular political phenomenon through which one can see at its apex the abstraction of the state from civil society. Marx defined the Bonapartist state as the war machine of capitalism against labor, but in apparent contradiction to this view, Marx also maintains that the class best represented by such a state is the peasant class. Hence the ex-liberals' good relations with the Parti Pret, which is therefore guilty of the swindles of moneyed aristocracy, and of the parasitism of strata gravitating directly around the crown. If, on the one hand, Marx claimed that parliamentary regimes can contain the germs of the Bonapartist state, and this is served for a Marxian interpretation of contemporary fascism, on the other hand, the Bonapartist state seems to strengthen those instruments of control and domination over civil society in ways that cannot be made part of a permanently valid definition of class. just as capital, freed from the fetters of bourgeois private property, in the modern forms described by Marx, tends to become capital sans phrase, plain capital. Similarly, according to Rubel, it seems that starting with Bonapartism, it is possible to speak of a state sans phrase, where the ruling class is progressively confused with the state apparatus until the bureaucratic machine of domination, inherited from the past and made ready for the future, emerges in full and regulates all political and social organisms. For Rubel, Bonapartism, so very lucidly analyzed by Marx, is the destiny of the modern world. Under the sign of Bonapartism, understood both as totalitarian oppression and as demagogic state populism that brings off revolutions from above, great national entities and large industrial systems were formed, or better still, those macro-historical phenomena parallel to the rise of large urban proletarian masses have led to structures of domination that have much in common with minor, still primitive and inefficient, quote, Bonapartism. It is impossible to continue with a concise analysis of Marx's writings without eventually posing the problem of the social nature of that state and society that officially identifies with Marx's thought, the Soviet Union. In 1957 and in following years, Rubel started thinking along lines fully compatible with the results of his Marxological studies. According to Rubel, with reference to Soviet Russia, Lenin spoke of state capitalism monitored and directed by labor power, a power identified with the Bolshevik Party as the, quote, external consciousness of the class and the only instrument of proletarian dictatorship. Therefore, by the admission of its greatest founder, the Russian Revolution, after an initial period when the Soviets expressed the anti-capitalist will of large strata of workers, saw the adoption of methods and systems illustrative of the tendency of capitalism to assume as homogeneous and intensive a structure as possible. But, according to Rubel, the socialist aspect of the revolution, the proletarian nature of political power, is nothing but a myth. In 1917, Bolshevism used Marx's thought to force the scant masses of workers, and those larger ones of later decades, to accept a much faster and more violent road to capital accumulation than that of the Industrial Revolution in the West. For Rubel, in some prophetic pages, Marx had prefigured a capitalist state as the pure state developed in Soviet society, which made a virtue out of necessity and managed to start a large-scale process of capital accumulation without recourse to the traditional auspices of the bourgeoisie. Marx had studied social conditions in Russia, had taken interest in its communal institutions, and had ventured that through their strength, and aided by the success of the revolution in the West, Russia might be fortunate enough to pass to socialism without necessarily crossing the intermediary capitalist purgatory. Yet by the last years of his life, this possibility seemed already remote to him. It appeared even more remote to Engels in the years following Marx's death. At any rate, the Russian Revolution would have had to be of a constitutional democratic type. If we abide by Engels' last letter, there is no doubt that the Menshevik hypothesis was, quote, orthodox and the Bolshevik, quote, revisionist. For Rubel, Bolshevism changed the Jacobin role of a bourgeoisie, unable to confront its historical task, without liberalism and in the absence of a constitutional democratic regime, by calling, in, quote, Marxist ideological terminology, quote, socialist accumulation, which was only the usual brutal process of capitalist accumulation. Marx's studies on the historical genesis and growth of capitalism were transformed into economic recipes for the building of socialism, especially at the rise of Stalin. This is how the Soviet state, a capitalist imitation regarding the technological materials utilized within a very brief time all the accumulation methods described by Marx. In this way, the Soviet Union, through party dictatorship, drew closer to the realization of capital pure and simple, free of the bourgeois obstacles, as described by Marx. Its theocratic state, founded on a dual ideological and political terror, has developed a perfection, that state sans phrase, that Rubel located in Marx's analysis of Bonapartism. Clearly, there's a return here to the themes of the immediate post-war period. Rubel speaks of, quote, managerial capitalism, regarding Russia and notes that the third volume of Marx's Capital has Marx using the term, quote, managers, which was later modified by Engels. Unlike the theoretician of bureaucratic collectivism, and closer to Castoriadis' analysis in Socialisme ou Barbarie, Rubel does not maintain that Russia could have overcome the capitalist stage to stabilize into a mode of production of a new type, unforeseen by Marx and buttressed by the oppression of a new techno-bureaucratic class and by politico-economic totalitarianism. With Lenin, and even more so with Stalin, the proletariat was not abolished. Instead, it was created. The division of labor became deeper. The state was perfected in its instruments of control and oppression. Monetary exchange became the main incentive for any type of work at the national market level, and the social and professional hierarchy became the very backbone of the new society. The Soviet Union did not realize Marx's hopes, and according to Rubel, it did not escape the intermediary capitalist stage. Moreover, it did not realize the Menshevik's slimmest hopes, and has not, nor is it in the process, of crossing the stormy capitalist river at the heart of a democratic constitutional system. Footnote: among them, Ritzy, Burnham, and Shachtman. Two others with entirely similar positions were Rudolf Hilferding on the socialist democratic side and Victor Serge on the libertarian side. End footnote. Footnote: Rubel recognizes he is not the only one to define the USSR as a capitalist state. In this respect, he also cites Tanikook, Rula, Bordiga, Tony Cliff, Castoriadis. End footnote. The Soviet Union did not realize Marx's hopes, and according to Rubel, it did not escape the intermediary capitalist stage. Moreover, it did not even realize the Menshevik's slimmest hopes, and has not, nor is it in the process of, crossing the stormy capitalist river at the heart of a democratic constitutional system. New section. The journal Études de Marxologie. In 1959, thanks to Rubel's initiative, a new journal appeared, more or less on the verge of dying out every year. Between 1959 and 1978, there were only 20 issues, which set out to deal with themes central to its research. The title Études de Marxologie says it all. It proposed to throw light on the genesis of Marxism, offer documents and testimonies, studies and analyses of Marx and Marxism, together with historical reviews, bibliographies, and unpublished translations. Today, these 20 issues are an indispensable tool for anyone wishing to dig deep into Marxological problems. In the quote forward to number 3, Rubel stated that, quote, Marxology does not adequately translate the more elegant form Marxforschung, but he believes that Latin languages should also find a proper term, not in order to found a discipline like, quote, Marxists claim to have done, but in order to delimit an undoubtedly enormous research area, the enormous legacy of Marxist thought, his practical involvement in organizations and institutions, his many epigons, and at the same time, the history of interruptions in publishing his works, the lack of a reliable edition of his complete works, and the abysmal ideological distance among, quote, Marxist schools. All of this calls for the existence of Marxology, a research area where scholars will have to fashion themselves as philologists, historians, economists, sociologists, etc. Marxforschung has found a safe place in the entire history of world culture of the last 50 years. Neither anti-Marxists who deny any validity or topicality to Marxist thought, nor, quote, Marxists who consider the doctrine and system closed and largely believe that socialism exists, or at least is on its way in this or that part of the planet, none of them can avoid Marxological research, even if they could, through tacit accord, censor embarrassing passages or mummify and transform Marx's work into sterile scholasticism. In the quote forward to number 5, Rubel asserts that the first step of Marxforschung should be the removal of the religious aura superimposed on the master's work and the refutation of, quote, Marxism as state ideology and party dogma. Meanwhile, Études de Marxologie translated or presented text often quite unknown, in France at least by Marx and Engels, but also by Sorel and Struve, together with essays by scholars like Hal Draper, Pipes, Maddock, Naam on fundamental issues such as the dictatorship of the proletariat, the cooperative movement, utopia, the history of the labor movement, the Italian Risorgimento, the impact of, quote, Marxism in various countries and or the Marxian and Lassallean interpretation of the French Revolution. The journal also published writings by Korsch and Rozdolsky and pieces on the Jewish question and the Hegel-Marx relation in the light of the eternal question of the dialectic. Of crucial importance is issue number 8 on the centennial of the First International, with Rubel's excellent chronology on Marx and the First International, also carried over to the next issue. Of equal importance are issues 11, 1967, and the Capital Centenary, and especially the 1969 issue concerning Marx and Engels' writings, particularly unpublished in France, on Tsarism and the Russian Commune. The 1970 issue, dedicated to communism, brings out the utopian origins of Marxist thought. Its object is to show that communism later degenerated into mythology through the mediation of the ideological apparatus of the state. This issue contains important texts by Moses Hess, Max Adler, Weitling, Rula, and Matic. The presentation of little-known or simply unpublished works, with comments and annotations, is definitely one of the major merits of the Etude. In issue number 15, Rubel published an essay on La Légende de Marx ou Engels fondateur, which I think is on this channel. The Legend of Marx and Engels the Founder, I think is what it translates as, suggesting that the early and still timid Engels was responsible for the buildup of, quote, Marxism. In addition to important studies by Draper and Bana, this issue also contains notable texts by Pierre Leroux and Joseph de Jacques, who was like a anarchist, I believe, or anarchist communist. In number 16, there's a translation of a Moses Hess text and of one by Marx on Friedrich List. In the last 3 numbers, 17, 18, 19, 20, there are also very interesting studies. In particular, there's a long essay spread over all 3 on the growth of the, quote, Marxist doctrine by Margaret Manal, or Margaret Manal, or Margaret Manal. She co-wrote the Karl Marx's Life and Works with Rubel. It says that right here, in the very next sentence. In particular, there's a long essay spread over all 3 on the growth of the, quote, Marxist doctrine by Margaret Manal, who, in 1975, co-authored with Rubel a chronology on Marx's life and work that remains an excellent conclusion to the 1956 bibliography. The last Etude issue features 2 headings: the cooperation of Rubel and Louis Genevert on a, quote, Marx dictionary, which is now awaiting publication by Deschamps de Souille. The 2 headings are, quote, State and Anarchism, and aim at restoring the libertarian substance of Marxist thought. The critique of politics which underlies all of Marxist thought, and which, according to Rubel, invariably runs through all of his thought in varying degrees of explicitness. It is clear that the Etude represent the most important contribution to the Marx Forschung. In fact, Marx muss studieren, after the first 2 issues of 1954 and 1957, dwindled in the frequency of publication and has in all cases strayed from the original objectives of research, despite the efforts of Irving Fetcher, its prime mover. New section. Marx as a critic of Marxism. In 1974, Rubel collected in a single volume some of his essays, especially recent ones showing the continuity of his work. A variety of themes are dealt with, all rooted in a viewpoint that seeks both philological accuracy as well as critical interpretation. A. The book The Legend of Marxism. Rubel's short presentation in the 1970 Wuppertal Conference on the 100th and 50th anniversary of Engels' birth, after noting that, quote, Marxism was born as an invective and insult, essentially attributes to Engels the historical and ideological responsibility for having reconstituted a critical way of thought into a doctrine. By believing himself its heir, Engels was in effect its founder. With this presentation, which created a great scandal especially among, quote, orthodox, Marxist and Eastern scholars, Rubel opened up some new ground for research, which was later enriched very competently by Margaret Manal, as well as others sharing his position, such as Hobsbawm and especially Haupt, who, though considering Rubel's provocative attitude, quote, debatable, in fact later followed in his tracks. That's super interesting. B. The book Marx's Anarchism. Or maybe this is an article. I don't know. I don't know. So maybe the Legend of Marxism and Marx's Anarchism are books or articles or just headings. I don't know. They're in italics, so that's what I'm saying. They're books, but maybe they're not books. Analyzing Marx's early writings and rereading mature ones as consistent and continuous with the earlier ones, Rubel holds that Marx's entire work is essentially a critique of the state and money, and argues that the critiques section on the state, contained in the famous 1957 project, but never written, could contain nothing other than the theory of a society liberated from the state. Bakunin, his own assertions to the contrary notwithstanding, fell victim to the frenzied elitism of a clandestine existence, suggested to him by the ever-thirsty romantic vocation of the professional conspirator. Rubel believes that these views were foreign to Marx, and that, strangely enough, there was a lot more, quote, Leninism in Bakunin's political actions. Marx is the, quote, theoretician of anarchism, end quote, however, can be primarily located in the writings before 1846. For the Marx of those years, political emancipation was the ultimate form of human emancipation within the established order. All politics was part of the old world, and its critique alone could open up a radical critique of the existing state of affairs. In this connection, there are fundamental appraisals of the French Revolution, Jacobinism, and the Terror. But Rubel believes that although Marx stood apart from self-proclaimed anarchism, he always remained essentially faithful to their inspiration, while also lending more emphasis to the analysis of the process of production and the critique of money than to the analysis of the forms of civil association and the critique of the state. One second. So I want to copy that down. Sorry. Sorry, this is annoying. Okay. C. The October myth. Rebels stand on the social nature of, quote, socialist countries, and the role of Marxism in those countries has already been discussed. State managerial capitalism on the social level and bureaucratic dictatorship on the political level. Marxism and Leninism are nothing but ideologies of accumulation. The Revolutionary Bolshevik Party became the vehicle of objective determinism of the productive forces in an extremely backward country which lacked a bourgeois ruling class free from autocracy and endowed with a clear modernizing outlook. The scandal of October is by no means the Soviet Union's transformation into an imperial power, but the propaganda that passed off as, quote, socialism, a process of capitalist accumulation that caused, even more than those preceding it, oppression and suffering. D. Party and proletariat. According to Rubel, what really counts for Marx is Selbstständigkeit, the self-activity and autonomy of the emancipatory movement. The parties that are periodically organized are simple means for the self-liberation process and the proletariat's self-suppression in a classless society. The historical party, organ of the proletariat, is instead the cumulative experience of liberation coupled with the utopian anticipation of future society. This party is the expression of the concrete movement that is finalized in communism and is the depository of consciousness and knowledge, but is never completely embodied in formal and specific institutions. The constitution of the class into a party is necessary for the conquest of democracy and for erasing all residues of the feudal and reactionary past. But from that moment on, there is the beginning of the process of self-emancipation, which aims at the suppression of the state and of money, and on the formation of a society where labor can be free from constraint and exploitation. This establishes a continuity between the utopians and Marx, whose thought is much more radical within a tradition that the radicals themselves initiated. Marx recognized the proletariat's spontaneity and saw within it a historical mission, while he at the same time worked, without hegemonial claims, toward providing the proletariat with knowledge of the laws of society and of the means and goals of the process of liberation. According to Rubel, in the real movement toward communism, Marx grasped the norms of a revolutionary ethic, which is both a critical consciousness of existing conditions and the anticipation of communism, both harmoniously tied to socialist utopia. This is why in Marx liberty, the revolutionary ethic, coexists with necessity, determinism of productive forces, and utopia with critique. With Marx, socialism did not proceed from utopia to science, as claimed by Engels and afterward by Soviet scientism. Marx never denied the utopian strain inside the real movement, while also analyzing with his critical, historical, and scientific rigor the laws operating in the process of production. Moreover, if socialism is a science freed from utopia, it is only normal that it should become the party's prescription, entrusted to an elite charged with bringing knowledge to the purely mechanical agents of social transformation from above and from outside. Formal parties and political labor movements struggle for the conquest of democracy, for the 8-hour day, for labor legislation, and for universal suffrage. The historical party that crosses an entire historical phase unharmed anticipates communism, the final goal of the long process of self-emancipation. The party as science or the party as power emerges instead in all backward countries where it has been established as the instrument of industrialization and accumulation. All of these themes are splendidly interwoven in the discussion of barbarism and the road to collapse. In fact, if, as according to Rubel, it happened, the conscious action of the oppressed, for Marx, men who suffer and think, does not intervene to affirm the positive pole of liberation as an inherent possibility in the determinism of productive forces, the negative pole of barbarism is sure to prevail. Hence the totalitarianisms of our century, largely the products of a missed process of self-emancipation, all tragic caricatures and ludicrous parodies of the sought and never found liberation, national socialisms and national communisms included. For Rubel, the triumph of, quote, Marxism, as political superstition in particular, is synonymous with the defeat of the labor movement and the decline of the great hope for liberty that went with it. This last phenomenon entails a great paradox, a misfortune-ridden and ideologized history of publications of the works of a master thinker who, more than anyone else, has often stood as an inoffensive witness, rather than a critical conscience, in the great theoretical debate on the meaning and destiny of our society. Therefore, a philological investigation seeks to recuperate a dispersed intellect. A philological investigation seeking to recuperate a dispersed intellect is built on a very precise hypothesis: the historical viewpoint in the context of continuity. Marx is not a magic watershed that marks out history in an irreversible way. Marx's advent is not the mysterious epiphany of a miracle pregnant with future or inevitable wonders. Rubel classifies Marx with that long process of critical Aufklärung running through the human history of self-emancipation, and demonstrates his indebtedness to Spinoza, Hegel, Feuerbach, and the 16th century materialists as well as Saint-Simon, Owen, Fourier, Flora Tristan, Proudhon, and many others. With the exception of oppressive societies, nothing was ever rejected by Marx, who instead sifted and reworked everything, at times perhaps in a spirit of anger, but always without ideological prejudices or disciplinary boundaries. This should also be the method of Marxological research. No matter what its conclusions may be, Marxforschung, as conceived by Rubel, works in full ideological independence. Among authors discussed and cited, there are reformists and revolutionaries, revisionist and orthodox ones from Bernstein to Luxemburg, Sorel and Kautsky, Otto Bauer and Trotsky, to Pannekoek and Korsch, and also conservative scholars like Pipes and Aron, and radical thinkers like Landauer, Benjamin, Horkheimer, and Makuza, without rigid contrast among, quote, Marxist schools or among political allegiances. Furthermore, Marxforschung proves a training ground for the unification of knowledge against all academic and disciplinary limitations. The world is actually full of, quote, Marxist economists, quote, Marxist historians, and, quote, Marxist philosophers, while Marxforschung calls for pursuing the intellectual adventures of Marx, the eternal student who filled out entire notebooks with quotations from the most disparate and diverse disciplines, because he was proposing, how consciously we do not know, the unification of knowledge from the single viewpoint he considered valid, that of critique. Later sanctified like the immutable receptacle of, quote, Marxism, Marx reached a cultural level and a mass of knowledge perhaps unsurpassed in his time. Paradoxically, however, he can only be described by one word, critic. It seems that for Rubel, too, this term is more than sufficient. Rubel's scholarly activity cannot be considered complete. In fact, he is now involved in a series of initiatives that might bring in the most important phase of his Marxological research, at least in terms of his activity as an editor. In addition to the Marx Dictionary commissioned by Editions du Suil, in collaboration with Louis Jeannefer, Rubel is finishing the Philosophie volume of Marx's works, with a mid-1981 date of expected publication. But perhaps the most important enterprise of his career, a logical and challenging conclusion to over 30 years of study, is a Marx Jubilee edition, an edition of Marx's works on the centennial of his death, 1883. This work is still in the project stage, confronted with considerable material as well as intellectual difficulties. At this time, however, Rubel is probably the only person in the West where states do not promote a, quote, Marxist ideology capable of directing such an ambitious work. The texts are to appear in the original language, Marx's own, and will be subdivided into 35 volumes to be arranged according to a threefold division that might be considered the result of Rubel's critical and philological reading of Marx, the critique of ideology, the critique of politics, and the critique of political economy. Thank you so much for listening.